All right, welcome everyone. Good to see so many people joining us today for our third and final focus group session here for our Sustainable Beef Research Roadmap. Today we're going to be focusing in on our air and greenhouse gas emissions, overarching goals for the roundtable. Really excited for our group of subject matter experts today to present and have a really fruitful discussion around all of our proposed kind of work to be done today. So we'll go to the next slide, Lauren. Just a brief overview of what our agenda will be for today's focus group session. We'll give a brief overview of how we all got here to this call today, some introductions of our subject matter experts, and then we'll get through a presentation from everyone and then go into a guided discussion and Q&A. And then next slide, please. Just a couple general housekeeping items. As I just mentioned, we'll have more of a first part being a dialogue to start, and we'll have all participants muted. If you do have questions while we hear from our experts, please be sure to put that in the question and answer section down below on your Zoom screen and not into the chat, so we can kind of keep a record of all of that. We do want this to be an interactive session, so really encourage everyone to ask questions, and if there's ever a point where it's useful to have you unmuted, we can go ahead and do that to further the discussion. We are recording this webinar, and we'll be sharing it with everyone via email after the webinar today. And then we will also have a follow-up survey that will be shared along with that webinar recording. That survey intention is to hear from you all a little bit more on what maybe have we missed in today's discussions. So would really encourage you to take a look at that survey, fill it out if you have any information to contribute, and share with us as we move forward to the next stages of this process. So just a little brief background on the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. We are a multi-stakeholder organization. As you can see on this slide, we span from cow-calf all the way through retail and food service, and then we work with civil society and allied industry with our mission to advance, support, and communicate continuous improvement of sustainability across the U.S. beef value chain. We have worked as an industry since our start in 2015 to define sustainability for the U.S. beef industry, and with that, define what are the high priority indicators of sustainability that we can be working on actively across all of our sectors of beef production. And those are those 6 indicators you see on the screen here. These focus group sessions that everyone has been tuning into have been focused on the environmental side of our sustainability indicators, and today we're focusing in especially on the air and greenhouse gas emissions topic. Let's go to the next slide, please. Just a little brief history. As I mentioned, we were formed in 2015. We've spent quite a bit of time in the early stages of the roundtable to define beef sustainability and develop tools and resources to help the industry with our mission of continuous improvement. In 2022, that all came to a head where we produced our industry-wide sustainability goals. So we have overarching goals across all 6 of those indicators. And then within each indicator area, we also have targets for each of our sectors that we work with. So since then, we've been working as a roundtable with our membership and all of our sectors to address these goals and work to determine, what sort of research and other activities can we be engaging in to really support making progress towards those goals. So we'll go to the next slide, please. This is a very high overview of our goals. Again, the one we're focusing in on today is air and greenhouse gas emissions. And I can put in the chat here in a minute a link to our goals page, just if you guys want to explore more on each of the other goals and what each sector is kind of doing around those goals. Go to the next slide, please. So we have set from 2023 to 2025, the roundtable has set our strategic plan really centered around the launch of our goals in 2022 and working to figure out how do we best drive adoption of sustainable practices and really engage in research and activities that are really going to help us to achieve and accurately measure and report progress on our high priority indicator goals. Next slide, please. And some key tactics within that. I won't dive too deep into all of that, but essentially key tactics here is engaging subject matter experts and across the industry and across academia to help us understand, best places to benchmark progress around our goals and ways to measure and monitor progress. So this activity and partnership with FFAR today is really bringing all of this together in a way where we can really lean into our academic experts and work to establish reliable ways to move forward with our goals efforts and identify where we maybe have gaps and need more information to be able to move forward effectively. So we'll go to next slide, please. And I will pass it over to my colleague, Jasmine Bruno, to discuss FFAR.
Thank you, Sam. My name is Jasmine Bruno, and I'm a scientific program director at FFAR, or the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, and we're collaborating with USRSB on this effort. FFAR was established in the 2014 Farm Bill, and our mission is to build collaborative partnerships to support audacious science that really address today's most pressing food and agriculture research challenges. At FFAR, we really look for our research to complement USDA's research agenda, fill critical knowledge gaps that we're identifying through processes like this, increase public ag research investment. Again, we're funded through the Farm Bill, and we look to match every federal dollar that we spend with a non-federal dollar to really push that ag investment further. And then really with a focus towards actionable research that is solving the current challenges in a collaborative way. Since the first project went out the door at FFAR in 2016, we've made over 360 grants. We have over 550 unique funding partners, and then over 750 million has been awarded at FFAR. Next slide, Lauren. So as we approach FFAR's 10-year anniversary, it is this year. We're actually looking to celebrate it in October. We conducted a strategy review process in which we engaged over 300 stakeholders in ag in conversation around where have we been and where do we need to go. Through that process, FFAR really focused on 4 priority areas. So you can see them here on this slide. Thriving production systems. So this work is focused on advancing crop and animal systems. So this is where I sit in our portfolio. Healthy food systems, focused on urban food systems and the health ag nexus. The agroecosystems team, which is also collaborating on this effort, really focused on soil health, sustainable water management, and our broader climate portfolio. And then lastly, sustainable workforce development. So from the FFAR side, we're collaborating with USRSB on this roadmap effort, and we're bringing team members from both the production systems team as well as the agroecosystems team, led by Dr. Lakeisha Odom, in this effort with USRSB, really in recognition that beef systems are complex, adaptive systems. And as such, we really need to support research that is dealing with this complexity. So supporting the production system as well as the agroecosystem component. So we're excited to be here, excited to hear from our speakers today. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Sam.
Thanks, Jasmine. So just given background on the work of USRSB and the work of FFAR, we have joined together in this strategic partnership to help us address as a start our air, land, and water overarching goals, and specifically thinking about the research needs and where we move forward to help support the live animal phase of the beef industry and beef production. So the goals of these focus group sessions, again, are to be very interactive, and we hope that you all will engage with our subject matter experts and really work with us to have a fruitful conversation around this topic of air and greenhouse gas emissions. So next slide, please. That's just a reminder. We've had now 2 focus group sessions ahead of today's. Both of those recordings are available on both FAR and USRSB's event pages. So if you'd like to, if you missed the sessions or you want to rewatch them, they're available to watch. And we also do have a link for each of those post webinar surveys available as well, and would encourage you to fill those surveys out and let us know of any topics or resources that we might be missing as we move into an in-person workshop later in October to really work to build out this roadmap. Next slide, please. So again, primary goal here, we want to identify research and knowledge gaps around our indicator areas for these focus group sessions. And we, again, want this to be interactive. I think we can skip through. I've kind of already said all that, but go into more of our goals specifically. So what we're talking about here today, air and greenhouse gas emissions. Our overarching goal for the roundtable is that the U.S. beef supply chain will achieve climate neutrality by 2040. And we will achieve this by improving carbon sequestration throughout improved grazing land utilization, reduce the grams of carbon dioxide per pound of beef, and support companies with achieving their greenhouse gas reduction goals. Specifically with our cow-calf sector, their target there is to achieve 385 million acres covered under written grazing management plans by 2050. And for the feed yard sector, working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 10% per pound of beef by 2030. So we've set these ambitious goals as kind of our guideposts for the work that we are engaged in here at the roundtable. And this is why we've invited our fantastic subject matter experts to join us today and really dive into this topic of air and greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll go ahead and introduce our 3 speakers, and then I'll pass it off to Dr. Place once I get through the intros. But so our first expert here on the screen you see is Dr. Sarah Place. She's an expert in livestock systems sustainability with over a decade of experience in academia, industry associations, and private industry. In her current role as Associate Professor of Animal Science, Dr. Place leads research related to understanding emissions from beef cattle systems with AgNext. She received her PhD in animal biology from the University of California, Davis, and a bachelor's in animal science from Cornell University. Dr. Place is a native of upstate New York, where she grew up on a dairy farm. Our next expert is Dr. Logan Thompson. He's an assistant professor at Kansas State University and grew up on a registered horned Hereford ranch in Central Texas, which instilled a passion to improve the sustainability of beef production by developing practical solutions for producers. His primary research interest is in measuring greenhouse gas emissions in grazing systems and how grazing management impacts ecosystem function. And our final expert here today, Dr. Troy Rowan, is an assistant professor and state extension specialist with the University of Tennessee. His research group uses genomics and precision technologies to identify and select for more efficient forage-based cows. His extension program educates producers, breed associations, and allied groups on applications of genomics across the beef industry. So without further delay, we'll go ahead and welcome Dr. Sarah Place to kick us off on this conversation today.
Awesome. Thank you, Sam. We'll get started. So I'll kick us off and then we'll go to the other 2 excellent speakers, Dr. Thompson, Dr. Rowan. But I will get started with kind of the bigger picture and a little bit review of what Sam had just talked about and a reminder of where we're at right in this process and coming up with an idea of where our overview is that intersects, our overview of research that intersects with USRSB goals and targets. So for those of you that are less familiar with the USRSB actual indicators, there's those 6 that were mentioned, and the definition for the air and greenhouse gas indicator is listed here. And I'll just point that out, and I'll kind of circle back to this a couple times. It is more than just greenhouse gas emissions, though both the goal and the target are very focused on greenhouse gas emissions, of course, with that overall goal of climate neutrality by 2040. Also, if folks are not familiar, I would definitely encourage them to check out that link at the bottom or just Google the actual goals and look at the full goals document from the US Roundtable, because there's a bit of an explanation there of what the organization means by climate neutrality. And I know Dr. Thompson is going to go through that a little bit more of what those different definitions can mean. So we'll go to the next slide. So those we've just given an overview, right? If we think about what the actual metrics and targets are for both the cow-calf and the feed yard sectors, what's important is when we look at the actual sector targets, right, it's linking those grazing management plans to outcomes related to climate neutrality, right, are very important. And that's one of those pretty obvious research gaps that needs to be filled. And then when we think about the feed yard target, it's much more of an outcome-based target focused on reducing greenhouse gas emission intensity, right? Which could be another discussion about intensity versus overall emissions reductions. If we go to the next slide, what's important is, of course, the US Roundtable is more than just the live cattle side of the value chain. It also includes packer processors and retail and food service, which also had sector level targets in this space. Again, that full goals document has the whole explanation, but I've just called out here really both those sectors are focused on monitoring, reporting, verification, coming up with goals and targets as related to their business, right? So less in terms of concrete actions that are actually listed and more about those MRV type activities as their targets within their sector. So if we go to the next slide, to set us up a little bit, right, in this space, we can think about pulling some information from the U.S. beef industry life cycle assessments, both the full cradle to grave life cycle assessment that was published last year, publication on the left in Journal of Cleaner Production, which looked across 18 different impact categories, environmental impact categories, including global warming potential and potential air quality impacts. And we can zoom in a little bit more on the cradle to farm gate environmental footprint, really, which was the basis upon which the other publication was built on, that looked at 4 different environmental factors. So we'll get into this a little bit if we go to the next slide. That full cradle to grave is really from conception of the animal, right, all the way through to the consumer or actual disposal of beef products. There's a lot of great information in this publication. I'll just quick walk through what this bar chart here is showing, right? So ultimately, down on the x-axis, all these different acronyms relate to each one of those different impact categories that I referenced. 2 that really matter to us are that particulate matter formation, which is the first bar, and then the global warming potential, which is the second bar. Looks like, unfortunately, those green bars got a little bit shifted as we've copied all these slides over. But the key thing there is to look at each one of these impact categories and note what % of the total it represents. So if you look down at the bottom, the beef, dairy, those are the live animal phases of production for both GWP, or the global warming potential, and to a lesser extent, the PMFP, so the particulate matter formation, the air quality implications. The majority of those impacts are actually coming on the live cattle side, right? So hence we focus a lot on that, but I also want to note that it's not all from the live cattle production, right? There are other parts of the supply chain that have a role to play in terms of actually reducing air quality impacts and reducing the climate impact of beef production. So if we go to the next slide, if we think about the cradle to farm gate, so this is raising animals all the way for them to go to the packing plant, where are those greenhouse gas emissions actually coming from? If we look at the y-axis on this graph, we're looking at the percentage of beef's carbon footprint, and then these different categories. So a couple numbers that will come back later in this presentation, right? There's about 243 teragrams or million metric tons of CO2 equivalents that are produced every single year, or at least relative to this average time period that was assessed from the US beef cattle industry. The majority of those are coming from enteric methane emissions, but there are other important categories, right? It's not all about the methane, though methane is clearly the biggest chunk of the emissions on a CO2 equivalent basis. If we go to the next slide, we think about the life cycle of beef cattle production, something that's familiar to a lot of folks on this webinar. And we think about both the production system in terms of where animals are in each one of these phases and what those animals are consuming, course, the majority of animals at any one time are going to be in that cow-calf phase of production. All the cows, the calves, replacement heifers, bulls, stockers, stocker and backgrounding phase obviously fluxes throughout the year, but again, majority forage-fed animals, and then followed up by our finishing phase, where we're going to have those animals in roughly 180 days, right, consuming a higher grain-based diet in the U.S. So it represents most all beef cattle production in the U.S. will go through a grain finishing system. So I point this out when we think about the proportionality of greenhouse gas emissions, even within the live cattle phase. These production realities really dictate where those emissions are coming from. So if we go to the next slide, if we focus our attention at this graphic just up at the top, this is showing the distribution of where these greenhouse gas emissions occur across those three production phases. So at the top, methane, the vast majority of methane is actually coming from cow-calf production. So for those that are not familiar with beef, sometimes this is surprising, but it's because the majority of those animals in the whole beef system are actually in that phase, and they're eating a higher forage diet, which leads to more methane production compared to the finishing phase with the high grain-based diet, right? So the more grain we feed, the less enteric methane we emit. Conversely, if we were to look down at the upstream sources, so this would include anything inputs, purchase inputs, including feed inputs into the system and emissions that are associated with those. And if we look at the distribution across those three phases, the feed yard or finishing portion is a larger percentage of the total, right? Which makes sense. We have more harvested feeds that are actually being fed in that phase. And so the emissions associated with those are higher for that emissions category. So it all depends on which emission category we're looking at, but overall, the total greenhouse gas emissions, the majority of them are coming from the grazing phases of the industry, which creates challenges and opportunities when it comes to actually doing research in this area and delivering mitigation solutions. So if we go to the next slide, because the actual metric and indicator is more than just methane and more than just greenhouse gas emissions, it's also important to look at the other emissions that matter. And for the life cycle assessment, there is some call out to specific emission categories. Again, I mentioned the particulate matter formation. In this case, we're looking at reactive nitrogen emissions. This would be all forms of nitrogen other than dinitrogen gas and where those emissions are coming from. So the percentage of the reactive end footprint is represented on the y-axis and the different emissions categories at the bottom. Ammonia is the single largest source of reactive nitrogen emissions that are actually coming from the cattle industry, the beef cattle industry, and followed by these other categories of oxides of nitrogen from manure and land, nitrate on down the line. And just to note, this is where some of these categories intersect, right? Nitrous oxide, of course, is a greenhouse gas, but it's also considered reactive nitrogen. Importantly, as I've called out in this box, 34% of U.S. ammonia emissions could be attributed to beef cattle production. So this is inclusive of feed production and emissions from animal manure. And I just point that out that it's a much larger percent contribution than the greenhouse gas emissions. So while it's not a main focus in the world today, thinking about future research priorities and coming up with solutions to challenges, it's something that we should keep on our radar. If we go to the next slide. This is looking at the similar as we had looked at before of greenhouse gas emissions, but now we're looking at reactive nitrogen footprint across those three phases of cattle production, from ammonia all the way down to the total at the bottom. You'll note in comparison to the greenhouse gas emissions, right, we tend to have a little bit higher percentage that's coming from the finishing phase, and partially that's because of emissions from manure and emissions associated with feed production that lead to reactive nitrogen emissions, especially as represented in that upstream sources category. So if we go to the next slide, what's also important in all this is just I've been showing you these bar charts with these nice, neat percentages. The challenges is, of course, those are US-wide averages, which are great to know and understand and help us figure out where hotspots are to target. But the reality is that there's tremendous variation from system to system and across different regions. So what we're looking at here is the carbon footprint of beef from that Rotz et al. 2019 publication across the different regions. So this is saying, what if all three phases of production happened within one region? That's another complexity. As we know, the beef industry relies on movement of cattle. So animals rarely are staying within one phase or one area, excuse me, in the United States throughout their life. They're often moving. But even if we make that simplification, these bars represent the average, and then the tops and the bottoms of these error bars represent the mins and the maximums, the minimum and the maximum of the carbon footprint within those regions. So huge variation, right? And again, that highlights some of those sources at the top, or what some of those sources are. Can be climate, can be soil, can be management related. There's huge opportunity to improve, but there also are sometimes just inherent characteristics of where operations are that make it more difficult than other places to reduce emissions. So just highlighting that complexity there. So if we go to the next slide, just in summary of this section, I'll kick it off to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Thompson. If we think about solutions, we think about research priorities, we do have to think about being place-based in terms of being where the solution may be applicable, right? Beef is unique in terms of it cuts across all sorts of geographies, climates, soil types, which is part of the strength of the industry and its resilience to work across all those different systems. But it's also challenging because it means there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to air and greenhouse gas emissions. Enteric methane is by far the largest source, but we have to think about how we practically, financially viably deliver solutions in ways that make sense, especially to grazing cattle, as that's where most of those emissions are coming from. We have a lot of focus on methane, and we do as well in our research group, but we can't ignore the impacts of beef cattle production on the nitrogen cycle, and in some cases, maybe a far more important thing that we should be focused on in the long run. And then just to think back to the other presentations, if you've been on these other webinars, right, thinking about the cross-cutting implications of these different goals, metrics in these different areas, and the research that could be done, right? None of these topic areas are in isolation. So things that we can decide to do or have interventions from a land resources perspective will often have implications for air and greenhouse gas emissions and for water resources as well. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll kick it over to Logan to keep the conversation going.
Yep. Thanks, Dr. Place. Not sure if I would call myself esteemed, but thank you for that table setting there. And thanks to the Roundtable and FFAR for having me be a part of this panel this afternoon. My charge today was a little bit different. It's to discuss greenhouse gas accounting and metric choice as it relates to the target that Dr. Place outlined already. Next slide. So starting back, and I'll try to keep this as consistent as possible with Dr. Place's slides so it's easier to understand. But our industry's goal for the USB supply chain is I'd like to point out, very similar to that of our colleagues in the dairy supply chain, and that's to achieve climate neutrality by the year 2040. Now, goal setting and choice of words are very important, but can also be, in my opinion, exceedingly confusing. And that's in part because people, whether it's industry or policy or what have you, like to change the words that they use or change their targets as a whole quite often. And even for myself, in my role here at K-State, I can find it kind of hard to keep track of who's promising what at any given point in time. But what's important for these commitments is the term that is used for the goal and the year by which it will be achieved. So for our purposes today, it's our goal of climate neutrality by the year 2040. So next slide, we'll have some definitions here, what climate neutrality actually means. I think many people can probably intuit what it is, but just for the sake of making sure we're all on the same page, the International Panel on Climate Change defines climate neutrality as the state in which human activities result in no net effect on the climate system. And this will be achieved by balancing residual emissions with emissions, i.e. carbon dioxide removal. So if we think of the climate as our bank account, we want our deposits to be equal to our withdrawals in the year 2040. We want a big fat zero there in our account. Now, this is in contrast to some other targets. One that I often see get confused with climate neutrality is carbon neutrality. That's specific to just carbon dioxide emissions. So carbon dioxide emissions are balanced against carbon dioxide removals. As Dr. Place already went through, if we had a carbon neutrality goal, that would be much easier for us to achieve, considering most of our emissions are not in the form of carbon dioxide. It probably wouldn't be as environmentally friendly as climate neutrality, but for our purposes, we need to be focused in on the accounting of all greenhouse gas emissions as a whole, right, and getting that account to zero. So next slide, please. Where do we start for that? Now that we know climate neutrality is emissions equal to removal by the year 2040, we need to start with what our emissions are. And Dr. Place highlighted that running average from 2013 to 2017, I believe. But that was 243 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions on average each year were produced by the US beef supply chain. Just on its own, that's a rather large number to wrap your head around. How do we get that number to equal zero? But ultimately, it's going to have to come from a combination of emission reductions and offsets, whether that's in the form of carbon sequestration, use of green technologies, what have you. It's going to take a combination of both things. And next slide, we can start to see some low-hanging fruit. Right, so referring back to that Rotz et al. 2019 report that Dr. Place mentioned, we're thinking, hey, where are the first avenues of approach where we can start to bring that number down? Enteric methane production jumps out. That is our largest contributor, and by far, if we want to make a sizable reduction in our emissions, that's the area we need to focus. I will also like to point out, anybody who's worked with me or interacted with me in any form or fashion know nitrogen emissions are not something that we can discount in our chase to bring that methane number down. We need to keep the entire system and our entire emission portfolio in mind when we're trying to design and build out some solutions for producers. But methane is by and large our largest contributor and where we need to spend a lot of time. Now, when we look at production systems, this is unfortunately where it gets a little bit complicated for us from a scientific lens, and that's the fact that cow-calf and stocker background are our predominantly grazing-based systems are by and large our largest contributors. And Dr. Place pointed this out, but when I go and speak with the general public, oftentimes they equate negative environmental impacts with confined feeding operations, and that's just not the case. Right? We need to focus on those grazing-based systems, and in order to actually achieve meaningful reductions. Unfortunately, from a research standpoint, those are very complicated to work in. I'm sure many of y'all have watched cows, graze across a pasture, and you can maybe get a little insight into what they're eating, but day to day, you really don't know what they're eating or how much they're eating. And we're also not designing their nutrition every single day to make sure that we're meeting their nutritional needs, both from a maintenance and performance standpoint. And things are much more complicated there. And then when we consider the average producer today has around 47 head, right? How do we design management strategies that are going to reduce emissions for them, but also be practical and beneficial for them to implement, right? And while those 47 head producers aren't the majority of the cows, that's still the floor for our industry. How do we bring the floor up while we're also, focusing in on those larger scale operations at the same time? And next slide, please. Looking in on that enteric methane piece, luckily, as an animal science community, we have several decades of research in this area. That's because enteric methane is a natural process or natural byproduct of the ruminal fermentation process. And it's an energy loss, a dietary energy loss from that animal. So we've researched this in order to keep dietary energy retained in that animal and ultimately increase performance. And we still see that there is some meat on the bone there for improved animal productivity to result in reductions in methane on a grams per day basis, and also a grams per pound of product produced basis or emission intensity basis. And this figure here on the right, I just have a quick breakdown of a few different research areas that we've focused in on within the animal science community. But what I want you to focus your attention on is that third column there, the one that says sectors. Not all of these scenarios or all these strategies are viable across all sectors. And in fact, the strategies that show the largest benefit, those bottom two rows being 3-nitroxypropanol, which will be marketed as Bovaer, and then red seaweed, Asparagopsis taxiformis, Currently, they seem to be most beneficial in confinement systems rather than pasture-based systems, right? And thinking back to that methane slide or that diagram of emissions by production system, if it's only good in confinement, right, that's only 10% of our methane emissions. So a 20% reduction of the 10% number is not a very large reduction for the overall industry. We still need considerable research and how to get those feed additives or those feedstuffs into our pasture-based systems to see the largest benefit possible. And then that third row I'd like to call attention to as well, that nutrition row. We do have a lot of practical research on grazing-based nutrition and utilization of best management practices in different regions, but we don't have that data corresponding with emission data. Right? The best paper I can think of, the data was collected from 1996 to 1998 in Louisiana from best management practices of grazing cows and heifers. We really need to focus in on regionally specific best management practices and how those impact emissions for those specific regions as well. We know there's a lot of benefits that can be achieved there. We just need to capture that baseline data. Next slide, please. And lastly, for me, because this often comes up, is emission accounting, right? So everything that's been presented up to this point is in what we call CO2 equivalents. And that's due to the fact that to compare industries, across industries, their overall emission footprint or climate footprint, we try to equate everything on equal standing. And we use, by convention, a metric called global warming potential over a 100-year time horizon. And that's what I have highlighted in that purple rectangle there on the right-hand side for CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Those are the first 4 rows of that figure. By convention, we use a 100-year time horizon, and methane has a GWP about 29 times that of carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is about 273 times that, 275. Sometimes it changes and I use the wrong number, but 273 times that of CO2. Now, using GWP 20 results in a very different accounting framework than GWP 100 for methane specifically, because it is a short-lived gas. You'll see it noted there, it's 82 times that for GWP 20 compared to that 29.8 number for GWP 100. So very different outcomes for accounting depending on which global warming potential metric or time horizon that we use. But starting with that global warming potential over a 100-year time frame, just if we're going to think of how does this accounting impact our ability to see climate neutrality, the next slide will have a few scenarios there. So what is the path here? So to achieve this goal with GWP 100, ultimately this figure here is going to point out that first bullet point there. Carbon dioxide removals in some form will need to be considerable for us to actually achieve the goal. So this figure on the right here is something we've been working on. And we have 5 scenarios modeled out there through the year 2050. So we have a BAU, that's the solid circle line there. That's business as usual for the US beef supply chain. And that's taken the long-term change in emission averages from 1990 to present day and applying those looking forward. And then scenarios 1, 2, and 3, we have instantaneous changes in management beginning in 2023 to reduce emissions in an increasingly aggressive manner, so up to a 30% number for scenario 3. And then scenario 4 is what we would consider a more practical scenario where we modeled out a 23% reduction in enteric methane emissions by 2040, beginning in 2023 with a small, about 1.6% annual change or annual reduction in enteric methane emissions. And the reason I use this figure is you see cumulative emissions on the y-axis in million metric tons for CO2 equivalents, even for the most aggressive emission reduction scenarios. In 2040, we still only have about 1,000 million metric tons different in cumulative emissions between those scenarios. So we still have a lot of carbon dioxide removals that we're going to have to find in various forms and fashions across the country in order to actually achieve climate neutrality in that year. Next slide, please. But the reason I pull that up is because we do know methane is a relatively short-lived greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. And this figure here, that purple box highlights its behavior in the atmosphere, where it's emitted to near zero, and it resides in the atmosphere, trapping energy for around 9 to 12 years before it's broken down predominantly by hydroxy radicals, but some other forms as well to scrub it out of the atmosphere back into CO2, where it's available for uptake, via photosynthesis or going into other natural sinks. So it doesn't reside as long, and that GWP 100 metric effectively acts as a stock gas accounting system. It works very, very well. And when emissions are increasing, GWP 100 does a very good job of capturing directional trends and climate impact. But when emissions are being reduced, its behavior just doesn't capture that benefit the same. So next slide, please. Here we have differences in how we account for that gas. So there was a new metric called GWP star. I'll just put it out there. It is a relatively contentious metric in the climate community, but it was included in the latest International Panel on Climate Change for calculating what we call global warming potential warming equivalents, or CO2 WE, for short-lived gas species. It is a more fit-for-purpose equation that accounts for historical changes in emission rates and has been demonstrated to be more accurate in determining actual climate warming. But as we can see here on the right-hand side with the dashed lines there, it can be highly, highly variable, and often due to population changes, right? So on this figure on the right here, we have FAO and EPA accounting for US beef production using GWP 100 in the solid black line and GWP star in the dashed line. For FAO and EPA, we do see some minor differences in accounting for emissions. That's strictly due to the methodology that they use. But year over year, it's about the same annual emissions for US beef cattle. For GWP star, we see a very different trend. And in fact, some years in the last decade that we just finished out, well, I say just, it's been 4 years now, but the most recent decade that we finished, I should say, we actually saw some negative values when using GWP star. If we were to put that on a cumulative basis, that would mean that the direction of our trend line is beginning to go downwards, right? Our emissions for those years are beginning to go down. So we're providing more or less warming equivalents than we are taking away from the system, right? So the year-to-year change is concerning. It makes it hard to use GWP star effectively, but cumulatively, we could potentially see an actual warming impact. And the next slide we have shows some of that. So looking forward, what do we see? I have that same GWP 100 set of modeled scenarios on the far left-hand side here. So again, business as usual with the solid circle there. Then scenarios 1, 2, and 3 with the instantaneous changes in management and the instantaneous reduction in emissions. And then scenario 4 being the more practical, slower to adopt emission reduction pathway. And what we see for cumulative emissions from 2010 onward, because that's when we can begin to add up these GWP star or CO2 WE emissions, we see that we can actually get to a cumulative CO2 WE of 0 relatively quickly with those instantaneous changes in management. And with the slower, the more practical scenario 4, we are able to achieve a cumulative value of 0 by the year 2038. So this is to say, if you use this metric, emission reductions alone can be quite valuable and require less offsets or insets via carbon sequestration. If we use GWP 100, we're going to have to rely more on those offsets and insets. And when using the cumulative GWP star, it might be able to buffer out some of those critiques of the system because we're still accounting for our historical contributions to warming and achieving a value of 0. And with that, I think that is the end of my slide, and I will turn it over to Troy. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Logan. And I'm going to give just a little bit of background, sort of a 10,000-foot view of how genetics plays into all this. As I was thinking about this and watching the previous couple of webinars, I think that genetics touches a lot of the focus areas of USRSB, but it's a little bit more difficult to put it into any one area. I think that genetics has a really big impact on things like land resource utilization and of course efficiency and yield, which is where I'm going to focus a little bit here on the very first part. Even in the air and greenhouse gas emission goals, that Sam talked about earlier, all of that is scaled by our productivity, right? So emissions intensity rather than absolute emissions. And I think that genetics has a clear role to play in both. So I want to talk about both of those and give a little bit of an overview of the state of the science and where we're at as an industry from a genetic standpoint across those. So you can go to the first slide here. And this is just a reminder slide that I put up all the time to show that we're doing more with less from an efficiency standpoint across the beef industry. So our cow numbers holding effectively at the same levels since pre-1970, while still producing a really large quantities of beef. So we've made our cattle more efficient. A big piece of that obviously comes from genetics, which if you go to the next slide, this is showing on the left panel here genetic trends in American Angus. So this would be our largest breed association and the largest genetic evaluation across the beef breeds here in the States. And for all of these growth traits, and it looks very similar as we look into our carcass traits that we've been putting heavy selection on over the last few decades, we see this sort of linear increases across these expected progeny differences. So these are the genetic selection tools that our producers are out utilizing to make more informed breeding and mating decisions. But what we see is that this linear increase across all of our growth traits, holding birth weight, of course, steady. That's a pretty compelling case for the fact that genetic selection works. If we have a breeding goal in mind, which over the course of the last 50 plus years, right, in the US beef industry has been for increased growth in productivity, particularly focused on these three sort of end product or endpoints, right, whether that's on the rail with carcass weight. Many of our producers here in the Southeast, of course, will market calves at weaning, and many are marketing fat cattle. So that yearling weight standpoint is where they're looking to make genetic improvements, right? So we're improving our genetics over time in a linear manner. The addition of genomics into the equation here back in about 2009 is when American Angus runs their first genomically enhanced genetic evaluation. And what you see here is that when we standardize across these different traits that are a part of the Angus selection objective, from a really nice proceedings paper by Kelly Ritalik at American Angus, you see that we sort of upped the level of genetic progress that we're making across these economically important traits, dialing milk and fat back in accordance with the selection program. But we're making genetic progress faster. And lots of that is coming back to the fact that with genomics, we're able to make more informed and accurate selection decisions on young animals. And so this is really, really important as we move into a world where we're introducing novel phenotypes, thinking about things like enteric emission phenotypes. The ability to supplement those phenotypes in our genetic predictions with genomics is going to be very, very important for us moving forward. But all of this to say that genetic progress is happening, particularly across these production-oriented traits. Next slide. But I think, and this is something that Sam and I talked about early on in this process, that there's still a lot of things from a genetic perspective, both on the efficiency and yield standpoint, but particularly as we think about how our cattle interact with our land resources, that I think that we're leaving on the table industry-wide. And those two big challenges that are still very much worth diving into are how do we match cattle to their environment and forage resources? We understand better and better that the sort of plentiful forage here in East Tennessee is very different from the forage situation in West Texas. Maybe not all cows fit all environments, right? So making breeding decisions that are environmentally aware, or making our cattle robust to the differences in environments and forage bases that they'll be able to go out and function in, is still a major area of interest, as is enhancing the lifetime productivity of our cows. Logan did a really nice job drawing attention to the fact that the cow-calf sector is where we have the most ground to make up in the industry, right? It's our biggest emitter. And so finding ways to reduce waste in that sector, make those cows more efficiently able to utilize their land resources, I think that there's lots and lots of opportunity in this sector, particularly using tools that are already existing, right? We have selection tools that allow us to make more moderate mature cows. We have selection tools for increasing feed efficiency, though of course not in this extensive forage-based system. I put pictures of these baldy Hereford Angus cross animals because something like 50% of our commercial producers don't utilize a structured crossbreeding program. Selection tools in the form of EPDs, utilizing crossbreeding in all of those other associated tools that we've got. So again, that's probably the last that I'll mention. These more efficiency oriented things that genetic plays into, but genetics has been driving these for the last few decades, alongside nutrition, health, and in all of our other management interventions. But it's going to continue to be responsible for those increases, the incremental and permanent increases in efficiency across the industry. Next slide. So as I sort of shift with the focus of this particular webinar being on air and greenhouse gas emissions, there is an opportunity to make, again, that permanent but incremental progress on reducing the emissions, the absolute emissions of these animals. The good news is that methane emission in cattle appears to be moderately heritable. Most of the studies that have come out thus far estimate it to be in this 0.2 to 0.3 range. This would be about as heritable as a trait like weaning weight is. So there's opportunity for us to drive traits related to enteric emissions forward. It appears to be favorably genetically correlated with feed efficiency. So that's always something that we're very conscientious of before we introduce a new trait into a selection program. We want to know that it's not going to work against the grain on the other economically important traits. And it really looks like enteric emissions phenotypes are working in the right direction with the other traits that are a part of our selection objective. But at the current moment, there are obviously no beef selection tools directly for enteric emissions. The Canadian dairy industry has released their first sort of preliminary estimates for animals' genetic potential for emissions. But these are largely based on proxy phenotypes from milk samples. So still a very, very large gap in phenotyping that we have to close if we want to develop these selection tools that allow producers to make that permanent incremental change directly on enteric emissions. Next slide. And so I'm going to talk probably for the rest of my time here about phenotyping. The big challenges in how we're going to have to think about this as we prioritize research. Metrics and monitoring across the industry is important. We heard it in the land resources webinar. Both Dr. Place and Thompson talked about it before me, but capturing individual animal information is absolutely essential to developing the genetic tools that we need to make these sorts of permanent changes in progress on enteric emissions. So a quote that I use all the time from Professor Mike Coffey at SRUC is, in the age of genotyping, phenotype is king. And I'm going to talk about phenotyping. You can go to the next slide here. Research farms. So the easier and cheaper that a phenotype is to collect, the more likely you are to get a record. And so I have this little phenotyping paradox graph that I give. And birth weight's a great example. We have got loads of birth weight records across all of our beef cattle populations. And that's because the barriers to entry are a hand weigh scale and just a little bit of courage to go pick up a newborn calf in front of its mother. But as we move down, right, and we get further away from that starting point, we have to buy a platform set of scales for a weaning weight maybe. Carcass traits, you have to have a little bit more integration maybe with your supply chain. But then as we get into this area where we're really concerned about, both as we look to increase efficiency as well as decrease enteric emissions, these phenotypes get much more expensive and difficult to measure, right? The barriers for a producer to collect enteric emissions data are all but out of touch, right? So we have to find solutions, I think, as a research community that allow us to close this gap a little bit, right? Shift these what we know are economically and environmentally important phenotypes back up this graph a little bit by making them cheaper and less difficult to measure. But that is, of course, a very, very tall order. Next slide. So the question, of course, is how many phenotypes do we need? And I know that there are a number of other animal geneticists on here, animal breeders that are more competent to answer this question than me. But generally, I think that to develop a selection tool, if you're not sniffing 10,000 records measured across a diverse range of environments and genetic backgrounds of cattle, you're probably not going to have a very useful selection tool at the end of the day. So this is, again, pulled from American Angus Association's website, the most recent accounting of the number of records in their database. And as you can see here, we're flush with records on things like birth weight, weaning weight, and yearling weight. Again, our barriers to measuring those is quite low. However, as we move down the line and we get to these more expensive phenotypes, so residual average daily gain and dry matter intake from feed efficiency testing programs, there's a huge drop off in the number of records available, and that limits the accuracy of these EPDs, right? So as we look at some of these other traits, the lower impact they are to collect scores on. So foot and claw, or foot angle and claw set, two structural soundness traits that American Angus started measuring a number of years ago. They've increased those records very, very quickly because the barriers to entry are low, right? It's a visual scoring system. Similarly, the hair shedding phenotype, an adaptive phenotype that American Angus started calculating EPDs for just a year or two ago, they've amassed a large number of records fairly quickly because of the low barriers to collecting those phenotypes. So again, this is just sort of setting the stage for the fact that if we're serious about making genetic selection tools, the real limiting factor is phenotyping. So you can go to the next slide. And the reality is that at the moment, phenotyping for enteric emissions is largely an academic exercise, and emissions phenotypes are valuable and expensive to measure. I know that Drs. Thompson and Place and I would all agree that these things are worth a lot, right? And they tend to be siloed at the moment, right? So we're all running our green feed units, and that data is all living internally at each of our institutions. We maybe have very different ideas about what we want to connect those emissions records back to. I might be interested in understanding a grazing cow's emissions to tie back to genetics. Logan might be interested in I don't know, some sort of a forage-based diet. Sarah might be more interested in the effects of a feed additive in a feedlot setting. Tying these together is something that I think is worth considering. How do we take these very, very valuable phenotypes to each of our individual research groups as we start to bring in industry partners into the equation, understanding how we could aggregate these potentially for the greater good of helping to make genetic selection tools at the end of the day. You can go to the next slide. And so the big questions I think that are outstanding are, how do we get phenotyping to the level of cost where it becomes practical for producers, industry groups, breed associations to take on these sorts of initiatives? At the moment, it just remains far too high. And even when we stop having some sort of a potential subsidized phenotypic collection, how does that sort of keep going on into the future, right? Once we're on the hook for covering the full cost of those as an industry, as a breed association, as a producer, is the juice worth the squeeze? And I think that sort of flows right into this idea of understanding how it fits into breeding objectives at the moment. So most of our producers are using economic selection indexes. So these are going to weight proportionally traits based on their economic importance to an overall breeding objective. and the ability to fit methane emission or some of these other phenotypes into a selection index remains a little bit cloudy, right? The economic signals are a little less clear at the moment, and certainly less stable than things like weaned calf prices, carcass premiums, so on and so forth. And then ultimately, who foots the bill for phenotyping once we move this past being a purely academic exercise is going to be a big outstanding question. I think I've got one more slide. And the last thing that I'll mention here is that I'm far from a rumen microbiologist, but I think that there's a lot of unexplored territory when it comes to understanding that ruminant host and the microbiome that colonizes the rumen. So understanding that these things are intertwined, the microbiome it appears to be very fingerprint-like and associated with its host in a lot of ways. We can manipulate it, but there seems to be a core set of rumen microbes that are tied to that host that they reside in. And then there's also a portion of that microbiome that appears to be heritable. So thinking about the microbiome as sort of a trait that's an extension of that individual animal's genetics. So trying to understand how those things all interact and how we might be able to leverage the microbiome in the way that we do genetic prediction is a major outstanding area of potential research. And again, I'll go back to the exact same thing that I said about capturing those enteric emissions phenotypes. Phenotyping the rumen is expensive. It's difficult. It's not something that a producer is going to be able to go out and do routinely in the way that we would need it in a genetic evaluation. So finding and identifying ways that we can lower the barriers to this sort of phenotypic collection will also be a very, very important piece moving forward. All right, I think that is it. We maybe have a takeaway slide here. And just to reiterate, right, genetic selection is probably our most promising or one of the couple most promising approaches to curbing emissions in the cow-calf sector, which is the overwhelming emitter across the industry. These are going to be incremental and they're not going to be fast by any means. It takes time, even with good tools. So understanding that genetic selection is a solution, but there's also some major gaps in how we do phenotyping and or data sharing across industry segments, academic industry partnerships. These are all things that I think we can continue to have conversations about as we move forward with establishing this research framework. But I believe that is all that I have got for today.
Thank you so much, Troy and Logan and Sarah. That was fantastic. Heard a lot of recurring themes, which is nice given the kind of diverse representation of your presentations. I think things that really stood out to me is being place-based. Our cattle industry is hugely diverse, so understanding the different areas that we're producing cattle in and how to work within those systems to understand best management practices, whether that be through genetics or other means of production, is going to be huge. And there's a lot of unknowns there. So this is exciting, an exciting challenge to be tackling. We have a lot of questions in the chat. A few of them, Sarah, thank you for answering. But I think just to kind of make sure for those who weren't able to or weren't paying attention to the Q&A happening, I did want to bring up a couple of them. I think the first one is directed towards Sarah, but potentially some answers from Logan and Troy as well. Is the variation within a region's carbon footprint due to modeling uncertainty and inherent cattle variation, or due to the actual differences in production practices?
Awesome. Yes. And thanks, Nick, for that question. And I realized once I put the slide up that I had an error on my Excel graph. All the automatic standard deviation bars that get produced there. Anyways, yes, it's within the region, like simulations within the region, and the full system within the region. So more of the production system differences or soil type differences from the representative operations that were simulated within those regions. And Yeah, not to put Dr. Rotz on the spot. Is he still on? Creeping on him here. Anyways, if I misanswered the question, he could correct me.
He is still on here.
Yeah.
Al, if you want to type anything in the chat, or if it's helpful for us to unmute you, we can do that. I don't want to fully put you on the spot if you're good. Just giving it a second to see if anything comes in the chat. I'm guessing we're good there. Thank you, Sarah. Another thing that came up was some questions around our definition for the roundtable of climate neutrality. I did link in the chat that the report that Sarah referred to that kind of outlines all of the reasoning behind the goals we've set and gives some pretty critical definitions related to things like climate neutrality. And I would just say, in terms of what is the actual definition that the USRSB works with around climate neutrality, it's that it can be viewed as the equivalent to net zero warming and can be characterized as achieving and maintaining net emissions at zero CO2 warming equivalents. So really thinking about what is the temperature impact of the emissions that are happening and how do we manipulate the emissions coming from the system to achieve that neutrality piece. I would leave it open for the actual experts here to add anything else there on that topic, though. Hearing nothing, we'll go into a few more questions that are in the chat currently. Let's see, we have a question. Does the industry, quote unquote, agree on a common regionally specific set of emission factors for an LCA life cycle assessment for the US beef value chain? And to what extent are climate smart interventions, grazing management, genetics, et cetera, taken into account for the US beef industry's life cycle assessments?
Yeah, so I can answer that one, right? To give an overview of that work that was done and that I presented, that was more of, again, that time frame that was put on the slide there of that 2013 to 2017. That's really when that data is representative from. So the process of that whole data collection to get to those numbers, to drive those numbers, was a two-step process of one, surveying producers both in online surveys and then actually going out to different operations across the United States to get representative production practices. Then there was a process of basically creating representative operations and simulating those with the integrated farm systems model for the specific regions, the climates, the soil types of where those representative operations were. So it's kind of a scaling up, trying to capture what was happening on all those different operations. So some operations may be, participating in some things that are so-called more climate smart versus others, right? But keep in mind the time frame of this assessment also, right? Of that mid part of the last decade is when this whole undertaking was going on. Yep. And it also looks like Al
Yeah, if we
would
want
like to say something.
Yeah, if we want
He would be the direct expert, and I'll stop talking.
Okay, I guess I'm here.
We hear you. Thanks, Al.
Now, what was the specific question this time?
So this one is geared at, sorry, I thought we answered it, so now I have to go back to it. Does the industry, quote unquote, agree on common regionally specific set of emission factors or an LCA for the US beef value chain? And to what extent are climate smart interventions such as grazing management, genetics, or otherwise taken into account for US beef industry life cycle assessments?
Yeah. I don't know. I guess there's two things to consider there. One is what the beef industry wants to use, and then the other is what the rest of the world's going to use. And are they going to be the same? Probably not. No, there is no standard, I guess. Everybody's trying to be more consistent and standard across things, but yet there's just so much flexibility built in too by the IPCC and everybody else too. So can we ever come up with a system that's totally consistent across everybody? No, it's not going to happen.
And Sarah mentioned a bit kind of the process to do the regional models for our current LCAs. Al, I guess I'd be curious to know from your standpoint, kind of what are some of the research needs that you see related to the most recent LCA, and maybe how we can leverage that effort and future efforts into modeling to help us maybe answer some of these questions, like the what will the industry actually agree upon, or the rest of the world agree upon. And I'd open that to all of our experts too. You know, everyone's doing a lot in the modeling space.
So I guess I'm back on again. I guess one of the things I feel pretty strongly about is, in order to measure progress, particularly in greenhouse gas emissions, but really in anything, you have to use the same model. Things are always changing, and even within a given model, it's going to change. If we're using IFSM, today's IFSM is not the same one that I used for the beef study, 5 years or so more ago. So we have to use the same model and really have to focus on what changes have actually occurred and how do we best represent those changes within that same model. I think that's the way it really has to be done. And that's, well,
Not a small ask.
it isn't, no.
Would say that's a nice research need to identify, or future collaborative effort to identify. Thank you, Al. I don't know if Sarah or Logan, Troy, if anyone else wants to add to that piece. If not, we have lots more questions.
Nope, I think that was answered brilliantly. Awesome. Yep.
Thank you very much, Al, for coming off mute for us. So let's see, we have a question here. Do any of the presenters have thoughts or ideas on how different academic institutions can better collaborate, particularly with the goal of increasing the number of methane phenotypes?
Yep. So that's a great question. I'll start and happy to kick it over to Logan and Troy. Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more power in us pulling data sets together, right? You know, we're accumulating a fair number of records here at CSU and same elsewhere, right? So whether it's kind of regional consortiums or other strategies that we use, right? I think that's going to be a way to accelerate a lot faster. And we'll have the same challenges of making sure that we're standardizing data collection and a whole host of other things that go into actually collecting the methane phenotypes. But the faster that we can accumulate phenotypes, the faster we can actually make real progress in this area. And I think Troy outlined that quite well.
Yeah, the one thing I would sort of add to that is that there's a lot of again, in our siloed academic institutions where maybe a genetics team isn't involved, but those phenotypes would be invaluable, even if the core question that you're asking with collecting those phenotypes is separate from a genetics question, right? So capturing pedigree information, capturing genomic samples on those animals would be really, really useful if we want to try and aggregate data in a meaningful way with the end goal of developing genetic selection tools I think that we could be better at collaborating even within our own institutions, with groups not letting valuable phenotypes get away without collecting some sort of a genetic piece of information.
I would also echo that. I believe that question came from my hallway. So back to Troy's point, even within institutions, we probably need to do a better job. And one thing that struck me at our last annual meetings was just the pure number of people working in this space that I just didn't recognize, right? And I think it's becoming clearer to me that our traditional annual meeting of getting together somewhere and discussing might not be nimble enough to collect all the data in the time frame that we need for the goals that we have. Probably need a more formalized, to Sarah's point, regional working group put together.
Thank you all. A lot happening in all of the places here, so trying to choose the next best question. I think this kind of plays a little bit off of the discussion we've just been having. To Logan from Hugh in the chat, grazing management planning is a sector target for several of our USRSB high priority indicators for the cow-calf sector, which includes air and greenhouse gas emissions. To what extent will enhanced forage quality and potential greater ground cover and forage production due to better grazing management positively contribute to reduced emissions?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one I wish I had like a range of outcomes for emission reduction just off the top of my head. But in areas where we've switched to high quality forages and using some targeted grazing and specific times of the year when forage quality is at its highest, we have seen differences relative to our modeled estimates. I'm thinking specifically to my PhD research in Michigan. Right, that's really high quality forage up there, and oftentimes our emission estimates were lower than what we would have modeled for them. Unfortunately, and this is back to that previous question, we haven't spent a lot of time working together to bring that data together across the different regions, and we also, until recently, haven't really had a lot of let's call it financial incentive as a researcher in academia to conduct that research. I'm thinking in the Flint Hills of Kansas, where I'm sitting right now, what happens with our stocker cattle emissions after we burn and we intensive early stock? What are the emissions there, right? Because I can guarantee you one thing, and that it's going to be different than what we're going to model it to be. And unfortunately, I don't know of too much data that's quantified that.
Thanks, Logan. I see Troy is typing an answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. For all the geneticists in the room, do you foresee methane or other greenhouse gas or air pollutant traits being incorporated into selection indices, or would greenhouse gases and air pollutants be something we retrospectively monitor from indirect selection for other traits like growth and feed efficiency?
Yeah, I'll sort of answer the first part of mine, and then Sam, if you see somebody else from the genetics community in the that could answer this or add to this, feel free to let them in. But I think that it's possibly both. The tricky part right now is that putting a concrete economic value on these phenotypes is really, really tough. So the inset offset carbon market world is just so volatile right now, from my understanding, that trying to put an economic value on those would be really tricky. If that stabilizes in the future and there's a real economic value on a unit of methane, then it becomes a straightforward thing to plug in beside things like dry matter intake, like average daily gain, like carcass weight, which I know that there was a question above in the chat about. So modeling these things in a selection index is optimal because you're able to account for all the other moving pieces. But at the current moment, the economic value that we can attach to that is still really murky. So having that again in the background, this might come for some sort of a verification program, right? It's a way for a third-party auditor potentially to come in and say, they're doing something to reduce the environmental footprint on their operation, because we can see that the EPDs of the bulls that they've purchased over the last 10 years for greenhouse gas emission phenotypes have improved. They're now in the top 10% rather than the 50th percentile. So I think that these tools could play into a number of different areas, but it's all going to come back to the breeding program. And if that breeding program is a part of a carbon market, then that's gonna obviously change things. If there's no economic value on it, then trying to get a producer to adopt that or trying to fit it into a selection objective as a non-economically relevant trait is going to be really, really tricky.
Building off that a little bit, thanks, Troy. I think each of you have mentioned at some point during the discussion today that there's a need to understand the other elements, right? Beyond just focusing on air and greenhouse gas emissions. What are the implications to land and water? Have you seen anything, Troy, or is there work in this space around kind of unintended consequences if we select too hard for something like methane emissions? How does it affect other areas of production or animal efficiency, health?
Yeah, I think that Dr. Erickson had a comment in the chat here that I totally agree with, right? That single trait selection for any trait is dangerous, but particularly as we think about even though there's favorable correlations between methane emission and residual feed intake, choose your favorite measure of feed efficiency. But I like to think about these as sort of the three component pieces. So methane emission, dry matter intake, and then average daily gain, making sure that you're not going off the rails with one or two of those at the expense of the other is going to be really, really important. So I think that most of the measures of feed efficiency that integrate that intake and gain piece appear to be favorably correlated with methane emissions, but certainly something that we want to keep our eyes on to make sure we're not coloring outside the lines or going off the rails with low performing cattle could certainly set us back, even if we did make some progress on methane emissions.
Thank you. So a question to all presenters: what do you believe will be the primary driver for producers' adoption of technologies to reduce enteric methane, especially in the cow-calf sector? I might shift that to say, what further research do we need to even be able to effectively answer that question?
Yeah. So I think one, we actually need solutions, and then they would have to be actually practical and scalable and then make any sort of financial sense, right? If it's something that makes day-to-day operations more complicated, right? It makes doing the daily work of being a rancher take more time, right? All those type of things. We have to consider that holistic picture from a more broader sustainability lens rather than just here's a technical solution that we could deliver. So I think that's part of it, is we have to do the in-depth technical work to figure out what solutions are, but then we had to think about that bigger picture of it's one thing to create a solution and it's a whole other thing to actually get it in use.
And I'd add on top of that, because I know there was a paper that just came out from Glenn Tonzer and his PhD student, Jamie Luke, that looked at 3NOP kind of as a case study for this. Right? But Glenn gave me a really good example a year or so ago on that technology piece. And that was the E. coli vaccine, a decade or so ago, where we built this wonderful tool. And it just wasn't, it didn't have any application in the real world. It did not help a producer's day to day. So this wonderful tool doesn't get used, right? If we're going to tackle this sustainability challenge, and specifically for us, the greenhouse gas challenge, we need to make tools that are usable, right? And often for our producers, our cow-calf sector guys, that's increasing commonly the amount of calves that they're weaning, whether they're sending them to the sell bond or a forward contract, right? They're interested in their bottom line at the end of the day.
Yeah, the last thing I'll add, and Logan was sort of headed there with his comment, a lot of the stuff that we have available in the genetic selection space can move the needle on these traits, right? We're not crossbreeding universally across the commercial sector, and that would make an enormous impact on productivity on a per land resource basis. There's a lot of low hanging fruit where we have tools and we have best practices. There's still a large percentage of cattle in the state of Tennessee that don't get castrated. So there's work to do across the industry, both on the leading and the lagging edges to try and shore things up. Again, whether it's related to land resources, whether it's related to efficiency and yield, or even to air and greenhouse gas emissions, a lot that we can do with existing tools. But certainly our more progressive producers, they've got to see clear economic payoff to doing these things. Otherwise, that's an immediate non-starter.
Thanks all. Few more questions in the chat. University of Florida has been doing a multi-year study with greenhouse gas towers for the whole system and found that beef produced there has a net negative emission. So it's capturing more carbon than emitting. Are there similar studies happening in other parts of the US? Sorry that I left that open, but are there similar studies happening in other parts of the US?
Yes, there are some monitoring experiments going on. My former lab group at Michigan State, and one of the first presenters that we had, Dr. Roundtree, has been working on some monitoring experiments to that effect. He also published, along with Paige Stanley, an LCA from southwestern Georgia, looking at kind of the systems-wide study. In general, those are long-term, expensive experiments to conduct, so they are limited. But in the last, Sarah, I don't know, maybe 5-7 years, there's been more and more of those projects kick off.
Yes. And I think the full life cycle piece of it is something that is really hard to do, right? So that's always important to keep in mind. The system boundaries of some of these assessments. It may be that the cow-calf phase is got one answer, but we have to think about the full system if we want to make claims about neutrality and other terms.
Feels like another opportunity for cross-institution collaboration and alignment on metrics and things that we're measuring. All right, I'm gonna have Lauren, if you wouldn't mind going to that next slide. We do have a few discussion questions that we just kind of wanted to throw out there for the group, and feel free to answer in the chat on these ones. But we've heard a lot today on many different avenues of research needs here and where we can be heading moving forward with our beef sustainability research roadmap. What should we be prioritizing near term, midterm, and long term around these goals? What do you see as the next frontier or something we aren't addressing that we need to be? And then what are the capacity needs or gaps required to meet climate neutrality in beef? And we could also open it up if Sarah, Troy, Logan, any of you have immediate thoughts on any of these questions. But would love to see in the chat if anyone has thoughts on these three questions here. We also will have these questions show up in the Q&A or the survey that we have going out to you all once we get the recording up. Nick, Beth says capacity needs is labor. Not wrong. From grad students through to, feed yard employees and all of that. Sarah, Logan, Troy, any thoughts here? that you'd like to pose to the group, just as we kind of start to wrap up the discussion here today?
Yeah, I think the key thing here of just the intent behind these questions and the presentations of that we've provided is just it is a complex topic. There's a lot to do, so it can be a little bit overwhelming. The intent behind that first question is more just thinking about what do we need to do first, second, third, and it may be multiple things, but trying to prioritize things so it's more of an actionable plan as we go forward and trying to actually achieve this pretty audacious goal of climate neutrality, right? And yeah, I think that those other questions are fairly self-explanatory, and we're a little bit leading the witness by saying, what about capacity needs? Because I think you've heard that a few times, right? Whether it's funding, whether it's people, whether it's research facilities, right? There's a whole host of things that we would need as a foundation to really execute on some of these great research ideas.
I see in the chat, carbon sequestration in rangelands hasn't been mentioned much. Is that part of the strategy? And the quick answer there is yes. We had Dr. Paige Stanley present on our land resource webinar quite a bit on that topic and a lot of the research needs that she sees in that space. So I would encourage you to head to that webinar and hear some of the highlights from Dr. Stanley on that one. Any other, we have a couple Q&As coming through. Okay. Sorry. From Dr. Van Eneman, my understanding is the sequestration on agricultural land is not attributed to ag production systems, but is allocated to land use change. I always forget what that full acronym stands for. According to the IPCC, why is that?
So I'm not sure if Allison's asking about global or US. If we just look at US, right, and we look at the EPA inventory, it is a separate category, right, from a direct emission standpoint, land use change, and forestry. However, the vast majority of the carbon sequestration that's assumed happening on an annual basis in that big acronym is coming from forestry, right? So one, that's an important thing to note. But also the data backing some of this stuff up is difficult, right? How many cattle are occupying these grazing lands that are attributed to having some sort of annual sequestration? I think if you dig within any of the governmental reports, it's really hard to answer that question. Never found a satisfying answer. So I think that's part of it is some of these things are accounted for in totally separate silos. And the uncertainty in those calculations is often far greater than the emission side of the equation, particularly when it comes to soil carbon stocks.
Thanks, Sarah. One last thing before I give you guys the floor for any final remarks, but just that Dr. Lancaster noted in the Q&A that investment in technology to make data collection easier and more accurate is something that we need. And I would agree that's something that would be kind of that tier one immediate. If we can figure that out, that will help with a lot of other things. I will go ahead and just pass it off quickly to Sarah, Logan, Troy. Any final thoughts here before we get to our wrap up?
I mean, I have one, I guess. It's a little different, but on something we're not addressing, maybe that we should be. At least in my productive lifespan as a human, I've seen large shifts in technologies that we're able to use as a beef supply chain. And I would anticipate that's going to continue, i.e. tools coming out of our toolbox quicker than we can potentially fill them back up with usable tools. And that would obviously impact the baseline that Dr. Place presented to start this afternoon, right? So as much as we need to be thinking about new tools, we also need to either prepare or safeguard, I'm not sure what the right word is, the tools that we currently have in place, right? Because those production efficiency tools are valuable. And heck, if we lose some of them, our footprint goes up. right? And we have more that we need to work against. That's it for me.
Thanks, Logan. Any final remarks, Sarah? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think just would echo everything that came up in the Q&A and the remarks by Logan and Troy, right? There's a lot of different areas that we can work on. There's not a shortage of what to do. I think it's more just going to be a strategic prioritization of what is the most important thing in this area is going to be more challenging because we don't have a lot of resources in the space, so we have to be smart about where we put them. And again, thinking about those cross-cutting issues again with water resources, land resources. None of these things are in isolation, right? So it's a difficult area to synthesize, but an incredibly important area for the sustainability of the industry overall. There's a lot of questions in the space from the outside community.
Yep, nothing else to add there. I think that Sarah and Logan summed it up well, but appreciate you having us on, Sam, and starting this conversation off.
Thank you all. Lauren, may we go to the next slide? All right, so QR code here for everyone. If you're curious to see our previous sessions, and we will in the next few days have this recording and the follow-up survey posted, you can go to this QR code here. I would say thank you so much to Sarah, Logan, and Troy for joining us and helping to lead this conversation on a hugely complex topic. Next steps, just for general awareness, we will be hosting an in-person workshop where we will take the findings from these 3 focus sessions that we've currently hosted, with the intent of coming out of the workshop with a sustainable beef research roadmap. And to Sarah's final point there of strategic prioritization, that will be a huge piece of what we're doing in person with the folks that we're bringing there to that event. So we're very excited to continue this process and for the outcomes the outputs that we'll have once we get through our October meeting. If you have any questions or further needs, feel free to reach out to me. Head over to our website again to catch those previous sessions, and please let us know if there's anything that you feel like we've left out of these conversations. Now's the time to let us know so we make sure we're factoring in everything when we get to our in-person workshop. Do we have any more slides, Lauren? If not, nope, we don't. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Lauren. So with that, I will let everyone out of here a little earlier. Really appreciate, again, everyone's time and looking forward to next steps. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.